Good evening, everyone, and welcome to SocialFlight Live. I'm Jeff Simon. We have such a wonderful show for you this evening. Martha Lunken is here, legendary aviatrix and author, and I cannot wait to have her here on the show on SocialFlight Live. Before we get started, a few things. Now, one thing I would like to point out right at the beginning is I've got something new right behind me here. I'm going to move over so you can see this absolutely stunning wooden propeller. I got a surprise gift in the mail here that just arrived yesterday from Elena Lewis at Culver Props. She was a guest here on SocialFlight Live, and it was so wonderful to hear about what's involved, her family story, that great business that she has, handcrafting wooden propellers for so many experimental aviation pilots, and there are so many great aircraft out there, and I'm looking forward to seeing some of those on the field next week at Sun and Fun. So I just wanted to let everyone see that gorgeous propeller and thank her personally as well for that. And with that, as I mentioned, I'll be at Sun and Fun next week. We will not have a show next week. We'll be skipping a week, but I'll be there on the ground at Sun and Fun. We'll record some stuff and upload it to our YouTube channel. Just do a search for SocialFlight on YouTube, one word, SocialFlight, and you'll be able to see some of the cool things, reporting to you from the grounds of the show and sharing some great personal stories along the way. In addition to that, for any A&Ps and IAs that are right up against the deadline here at the end of March for being able to get their hours, their recurrent training hours in to renew their IA certificate, please know that SocialFlight now has for free recurrent training online. Again, just go to socialflight.com or the free SocialFlight mobile app, and you can get your training and certificates for free. We are doing this, of course, for you with everything that we do to support General Aviation. Now, with that, I'd like to just say I am a huge fan of my next guest here on SocialFlight Live. Martha Lunken has been a pilot and a passionate advocate for our aviation community for nearly 60 years. For many of us, her honest and sometimes irreverent stories have been required reading with every magazine issue that hits the stands or comes into our mailbox. And her book, Unusual Attitudes, is a treasure trove of stories of an aviation life well lived. Some especially fortunate pilots, I think, have been very fortunate to take lessons or get their check rides with her and have a very special form of autograph in their logbook. With over 12,000 hours of flight time, Martha's held ratings including ATP, airplane, single engine, multi-land and sea, and even commercial hot air balloon rating. I'm going to bring Martha online now with us, and I am thrilled to welcome to SocialFlight Live, Martha Lunken. How are you doing tonight, Martha?
I'm fine, Jeff. Thank you. Thank you.
It is so wonderful to have you here on the show, and I'd like to thank you for taking time to share your story here with us.
Well, it's good to be here. You know, you've had so many really wonderful aviators, my heroes. I watched Bruce Bohannon and I thought, oh Lord, I can't match somebody like that. Bruce is a great pilot, great person. And
I have to tell you, one of the things I have always found is that some of both my personal heroes and some of the other legends of aviation that I have been so fortunate to have here on the show are also some of the most humble, wonderful human beings, yourself included. And I will say that after I got off the show with Bruce Bohannon last week, and I told him after the show that you were coming on, he said, "Oh my God, please tell Martha that I am her biggest fan."
That's beautiful. That's wonderful. I mean, he is an extremely talented and a very nice person. Yes,
absolutely. So listen, we've all read so many wonderful things from you over the years. I would like to get a kind of a synopsis of your story a little bit about how you got started. Like, what was it that brought you into aviation and started you on the path of becoming the Martha Lunken that we all know?
That's probably a great question for anybody. And I was discussing this the other day with Barry Schiff, and I said, how did you get started? And he said, I was close to being a juvenile delinquent when I was 11 or 12, and my parents shipped me off to my grandparents on the East Coast. And that airplane flight from LA to the East Coast, he said, I was hooked and I knew what I wanted to be. And that was his life's work. So we all have, I think we all have different stories, but I can't place my finger on what it was. I was 7 or 8 years old, and I remember having dreams about flying. I mean, literally flying without an airplane. And then I remember seeing a movie, and I think it was The Bridges at Toko-Ri. It was brand new then, and these jets were screaming down these valleys. And I remember coming home and thinking, I'm going to do that. Looking out the window in my bedroom and saying, I am going to do that. I don't know how. I don't know anybody who flies. Nobody in my family flies. We live on the other side of the town from the airport. But fortunately, in high school, there was a priest who rather reluctantly taught a course in religion to this Catholic girls' high school. And Father Blomey and I became pretty good friends. He had an airplane and he had a license. So after I graduated, I was in college and I was working at night in a ladies' department store to earn my tuition. And I think I'd saved up $200. And I called Father Blomey and I said, I have enough to learn to fly, $200. I mean, even in 1960, that was. So he said, well, hey, another priest and I own an air coupe out at Lunken Airport. And he said, we never fly it. Why don't you just use that airplane, put fuel in it and hire an instructor? So this picture will always remain in my mind. It was December and it was a cold, awful day in December, Sunday morning. And my sister, who was also interested in flying, and we had both read Wolfgang Langewish and I don't know what all. We arrived at Lunken Airport, and it was a little shack down on the south end of the field, not the place where people with money went to learn to fly. And we had our little lace hats on and our high-heeled shoes and our purses and our coats. And I was 19, and we walked in the door of this little shack. And of course, the old, what was his name? He used to call them the geezers who sit around on Sunday morning, and kibitz were all in there. And they looked at us like we were right off of Mars. Who are these people? And then the door opened to the back room, which was a little office, and who walked out? Hal Shevers, who was to become Sporty some years later. So we began flying the air coupe, which needed a little work before we could fly it. It was leaking fuel tanks, but it was sitting out in the grass, just roosting out there, and hadn't been flown much. And that was it. I mean, that was it.
Oh my goodness.
Soloed in about, I don't know, it was winter time, so we couldn't fly every day, but probably a couple of months, maybe 6 weeks, 2 months, and then went on to get private licenses. Now, I had completed 3 years of college, but I had an offer from TWA to come work as a hostess, go to training. So I did, and stayed about 6 months.
Now, before you go on from there, Barry Schiff sent me a picture. It's funny that you should mention that. Tell me if you recognize that.
That's it. That was my graduation from TWA. Wow. Thanks, Barry. Barry went to work for TWA about 2 years later, and he always says, damn, why didn't you stay with the airline? But I bailed out after about 6 months, and it was lonely. I didn't know anybody. I was in Chicago, didn't have a car, and and I wanted to come back home and fly little airplanes. So, but when I did get back, a man named Eddie Lunken was forming a little airline with Lockheed 10s, which were called Electras, not the turboprop Electras, but these were the Amelia Earhart Electras. And he had heard that I had been, pardon me, through hostess training, and he said, I need a hostess for this Lockheed, which carried 10 people. So I became a hostess, baggage hauler, handler, drink mixer, part-time co-pilot. And I think the second week we were in northern Michigan, which is where we took people in the summertime to their cottages up in the Harbor Springs area. We fell madly in love, and he proposed. And he was Howard Hughes. Ebby had won second place in the Bendix. He was a race car driver. He had a P-51, beautiful. And of course, there were problems. I was a airport rat from the west side of Cincinnati, which certainly wasn't the elite, part of town. And as time went on, rather than getting married immediately, it went on for 8 years. And I continued to work for him. We went to Cleveland and Columbus on the schedule, got a DC-3, but the business fell apart. The equipment was old. There were problems with that. And Ebby was lots of things, but he was not a businessman. So about 8 years later, we got married. I, meanwhile, finished up the last year of college. And I remember so well, and I think this says a lot about the feeling. I went to an interview. I graduated in English literature. Went to an interview at a chemical company downtown. They wanted an advertising copywriter. And I went into this room, and I remember the room was painted gray, and the table was gray. And these men around the table had gray hair, and their skins were gray, and everything was gray. And I interviewed, and I think they were impressed. I mean, I had good grades, and I was reasonably intelligent. And they said, we'll be in touch. And I had a strong feeling they were going to offer this job. And I remember walking down the stairs onto the street in downtown Cincinnati, sitting on the curb in tears and saying, Martha, you can't do this. You can't do this. And I got in my old Volkswagen Bug, which was a hand-me-down from my sister, and drove out to Lunken Airport and asked if Bob Walker at Cincinnati Aircraft would hire me as a flight instructor. I had the flight instructor. In those years, you've got a private, a commercial, and then a flight instructor. And then you could earn enough money, hopefully, to earn your instrument rating. So things were a little bit different. And from that point on, I instructed, worked for Ebby part-time. And then about 1972, we were married. I think we went through 3 applications for marriage licenses, and I kept backing out. But one of the wonderful things was Eddie bought a Lodestar. He loved Lockheeds. And there was a story at that time, I don't know if you remember it, about a lion named Frazier. And Frazier was an old lion in a Mexican zoo. And I think the San Diego Zoo bought Frazier just to save his life. Mm-hmm. And they let him loose in the lion's den, and he impregnated 2 or 3 lionesses. So somebody painted a big picture of Frazier on the side of the nose of the Lockheed, which was very funny.
What did you think about flying the Lockheeds? I mean, that's a very unique aircraft to have a good history with.
It was a magnificent airplane. It was truly magnificent. We flew it for a little while, and then we went to Florida, and Ebby dropped me off with the airplane in Fort Lauderdale, and a guy named Bill Conrad worked with me for 3 days. And I had a single engine ATP, but I got the the multi-ATP and the Lockheed type rating from Bill. And that Lodestar was a single pilot Lodestar, which was kind of unique. So one of the stories that will always stay with me was I called Abby up in Fernandina Beach and I said, you know, I got the type rating, I'm ready to go. And he said, okay, I'll come back down to Fort Lauderdale. And I said, well, the weather's really good. And, you know, why don't I just bring it up? And he said, well, okay, fly low over the golf course and we'll come out to the airport and pick you up. So I remember getting out to Red's aircraft in Fort Lauderdale at the crack of dawn to start this thing because, you know, the hardest part of flying a Lockheed or a DC-3 is starting those damned engines if they get cranky. And I didn't want people saying, look at that girl up there, you know, she's... But anyway, there was fog, of course, at Jacksonville and that area. So I had to wait a couple hours. Got her started, took off, flew up to Fernandina Beach. And I remember thinking, gosh, when I roll in this magnificent airplane and into the ramp in front of the FBO, think of what people are going to say. And I did. And there wasn't a soul on that airport, not one living soul. So
almost makes you want to take off and go somewhere else and come back later.
Try it again. But we kept the Lockheed for a while, and whenever I could, he didn't like me flying at single pilot, and there were some problems with, you know, it was a lot of airplane to handle in an emergency. But I remember flying it up to Hamilton Airport, which is northwest of Cincinnati, and landing and borrowing the airport car, buying groceries at a wonderful, unique grocery store up there, Jungle Jim's, and then flying back and bringing the car out on the ramp and taking the groceries out of the Lockheed. And a drunk came out of the Sky Galley bar and said, I don't believe this. You go grocery shopping in that Lockheed.
That's awesome.
It was fun.
What about the Electra? What were your thoughts on that?
Well, the Electra was a lot less airplane. You know, it weighed 10,499, and it had smaller engines. Actually, it had the same engines as a Twin Beach, 450 horsepower. The Lodestar had the same engines as a DC-3. They were Wright engines, 1820s. So the Lockheed 10 was a lot less airplane to handle. It was underpowered, you know, with a full load. It wasn't the. But and I, of course, I manned the ticket counter. In fact, I used to get to the airport before light and open the ticket counter and stay there until it was after dark and Ebby had come back. He usually flew most of the flights, and I can remember a very neat experience where we were opening a station in Columbus. So Eddie said, go up to Columbus and interview this girl who wants to, you know, work at the ticket counter. So we got the flight out, I bid everybody goodbye, helped load their luggage. And then I jumped in, I think a Cessna 140 and flew and landed up at Columbus. And I was inside at the new ticket counter as our flight landed and people walked inside and they were looking like, is this the same person who saw us off? So, and another funny one, this airline was funny. You needed a certificate of convenience and necessity to fly out of state with anything larger than $12,499. And Ebby spent a lot of money trying to get that, but it didn't work. I remember a passenger going behind the ticket counter in Columbus and the flight wasn't there, and nobody at United or the other airlines would help because they didn't like us cutting in on their business. And he knew a little bit about a teletype, and he typed, "Where is flight 101. And a teletype, if you don't hit a special key, you get numbers where you mean to get letters, and it's an old-fashioned machine. And the answer was, who is this? And he said, a passenger. And the answer to this very frustrated man was, sir, you are not allowed behind the ticket counter.
That's funny. It's also, there aren't many stories out there of someone beating someone in a Cessna 140. That's usually not like what you take to get to point A to point B as fast as possible. Although,
Well, if you jump
maybe
in and go and you don't file, you just those were different days.
you're redefining underpowered by.
And
by the
I had gone from the air coupe to a Piper Colt, which wasn't much different from an air coupe because they're interconnected controls. And then a P&G pilot who was a great friend, Will Adams, said, hey, I'll teach you to fly this Cessna 120. And I remember renting that 120 from a character named Tony Mayer, and rented it for $7 an hour wet. And
sign me up.
Yeah, going from a Piper Colt to a Cessna 120 was, thank goodness Will was a great teacher. So I've been a tailwheel fan and have owned many Cubs, and now, of course, my beloved 180 for almost all my life. Yeah.
It's true. I mean, it makes you, without a doubt, a purist of flying. The stick and rudder skills just go on from there. So I don't want to miss too much on your progression, though. So at that point in time, were you flight instructing as well? Well, when did Miss Martha's flying school come in?
Well, I was working half a day for Abby and then instructing the other half. And then I thought, why am I instructing for other people? And I borrowed $5,000 from my father and bought a 1966 Cessna 150. And Abby had a big hangar. So we put Miss Martha's Flying School, Midwest Flight Center, in there, and I leased back a Citabria and I think another 150, and offered. And then very quickly, the FAA was looking to increase their 141 schools, and so they asked me if I was interested in being a 141 school. I think you had to be in business for a year. And I said, yeah, especially because you got examining authority, or you could get it. So, but I said, gosh, Leo Wonderly was the FAA inspector. I said, Leo, I don't know if I'm up to writing a manual and a training program. And he said, here's the training, the manual from the Miami University Flight School at Oxford. Just copy it and change the appropriate names and places, which I did. And then he said, okay, we'll get it in the office and then we'll send it back to you for correction. And I said, why would you send it back for correction? It's already been accepted. And he said, we always send things back for correction. And that was my first real insight into what makes the FAA run. But we had a 141 school, and I even taught aerobatics, which was self-taught. Michael Devaney, who leased me the Citabria, said, here's a book by Dwayne Cole, Roll Around a Point, read it, and then practice over my farm. And for a while, I'd see sky and ground and sky and ground, try a snap roll or something. But I became fairly proficient in basic aerobatics, and taught that. And there were some funny stories about that too. But so then, I guess. Oh, and Ebby had bought a Pete and Pole air camper. For some reason, I think he was a little drunk. He thought that was a World War I look-alike. And the guy flew it to Cincinnati, and Ebby took it apart with his buddy and race car buddy, and they weren't interested in it. So Mike and I bought it. Mike Devaney and I bought it, and we put it back together. And I flew that for 10 years. I guess that was the first airplane I really owned. Yeah. And I would fly back and forth to Lebanon to give flight instruction part of the day. And yeah,
So you were giving flight instruction in the Pete and Paul?
no, I was just commuting.
Uh-huh. You don't hear,
And
you also, that's another thing you don't hear much, Martha, is someone saying that they commuted in an air camper.
people. Yeah. I flew it to Oshkosh. I mean, I'm sorry, Ottumwa, when the Antique Air Show was still at Ottumwa Airport. And I can remember coming home, there was a cold front had gone through, and the higher you got, the more tailwind. So I climbed to, as high as that little thing would go, but I knew it was going to be cold up there, and I didn't want to steal the cover off the motel bed. So I took the mattress pad and I flying this thing home. Those were good times. Yeah.
That's funny. I
So
wish you had a picture of that one.
yeah, I do too. So Eddie and I got married, and we flew at first a good bit. And I had 3 or 4 part-time instructors who kept the flying school going, and I did some instruction. But, he was from the cream of Cincinnati society, and I mean the cream of Cincinnati society. And pretty soon I found myself trying to live in that world, throwing dinner parties and cocktail parties. And of course, most of his friends were 30 years older, taking golf lessons. And I lost myself. I really lost myself. I remember one time I landed a Cub on the fairway, the 9th fairway at the Camargo Club, which was not looked upon very well. But he moved away from airplanes. I was still hanging in there. But as I said, I was losing myself. And finally, after about 8 years, it wasn't going to work anymore. So we parted. He's a wonderful man. He's gone now. But those things are always two-way deals. It's no one person is at fault. And I was faced with, do I want to go back and operate this flying school and live essentially from hand to mouth? But the FAA had been after me to join the FAA because I had an ATP. I had a lot of time. I had 6,000 hours of instructing at that point.
Wow.
Pardon me. So, but it was going to take them, some months to make this happen. So I wrote copy for Hal Shevers at Sporty's Pilot Shop. I taught 3-day traveling ground schools. I flew a King Air for a guy, businessman. And then the call came, yeah, we need you in the air carrier office in Chicago. So, I had never worked for any company at all. I mean, except selling ladies sportswear and working for Ebby. And the FAA was part of the government, which is the biggest company in the world. And I was lost there too. I had some problems, a divorce, some surgery that was kind of serious. And I was down to about 85 pounds. And I arrived in this air carrier office, and it took me, I don't know, 2 or 3 months of sitting there reading manuals to realize I don't know what in the world this is all about. These guys were all ex-airline pilots or retired. And I'd go along on some of the surveillances, but I didn't know what they were doing. I remember I had the standby one night and one weekend, and I got a call from O'Hare. There was an emergency because this DC-9 didn't have a compass correction card in the cockpit. And I thought, I don't really think that's reason to, cancel this flight. And then they sent me to a thing. I went through the ground training for a month in Oklahoma City, which is no big deal. And then I went back out there for what they called jet eval. And jet eval, somebody said in Chicago, don't worry about it, it's a Sabre liner, it's a no-brainer. Well, when I got to Oklahoma City, it was a DC-9. And we had 2 days of introduction to the DC-9, you know, in a classroom, and then we were supposed to be able to fly it. There was another man and myself, and the other guy had been a co-pilot for, I don't know, one of the airlines, a furloughed. And I clearly couldn't handle that airplane. I mean, hell, to start it and taxi it was a major accomplishment for me. So I remember the instructor, or the check pilot, was an Indian, a nice guy. And he said, you know, you're going to have to show proficiency in everything except ATP, emergency maneuvers, ATP proficiency in everything except emergency procedures. And I said, I can't do that. He said, I know. So they shipped me back home, and it was a failure. So failure doesn't come easily to me, but that's what it was. And then later on, I thought, you know, that was truly unfair. That was just crazy.
Yeah,
But
they set you up for it, you know, without even knowing.
It felt like it. So they asked if I wanted to transfer to the General Aviation operations out at DuPage. And I said, yeah, and I lived on the first floor of a funeral home in St. Charles. And
the first floor of the funeral home? That's usually not for people that are living.
Right. They did most of their work in the basement and upstairs, I guess.
Wow.
And the business of the FAA for an operations inspector did not come easily to me. It was a lot of reviewing manuals, and you know, but it was also a lot of violations. And I remember one of the inspectors, we had a bullpen, great big room. I remember well, his name was Harry, and he came charging across the floor, and he pointed his finger at me and yelled, "You're always out for the pilot." And I thought, yeah, and I planned to stay that way. Well, I think they had enough of me. I remember at one point the operations manager asked me, he said, what do you want to be? And I thought about it for a few minutes, and I said, a saint. And so they shipped me out of there to Indianapolis, which was glorious. The people in the Indianapolis office were real people, wonderful people, and the customers were great people. I loved the people in Indianapolis. I wanted to get back to Cincinnati. My mom and dad were very elderly, and so I had a kind of a bid in for that. And I remember my boss in Indianapolis said, "Are you sure you want to do this?" Because the manager in Cincinnati was, to put it mildly, difficult. But I did come back, and I came back as what they called then the safety program, no, the accident prevention counselor. And it soon morphed into the safety program manager. Didn't mean anything. But I was cut out for that because I gave safety seminars, which were loosely called hangar parties, throughout our region on the southern half of Ohio. And I remember the guys in Indianapolis or in Columbus and Cleveland saying, "Stop this, you're making us look bad," because I had at least one safety meeting every week, and people would bring food, and I'd show a film, or you know, have a speaker, but they were fun. And I was able to really make connections with these pilots, and to this day they remain friends, very good friends. In fact, when I retired, somebody threw a party out in one of the hangars at Claremont County, a big retirement party, and it was lots of people, but 2 people from the FAA. So I was not beloved by the FAA.
And yet you were so far ahead of your time, because it sounds like the work that you were doing then eventually is what the FAA decided through the FAST team, through the FAA safety team. They want to get more and more out there and engaged and getting people
well,
together.
I hope you're right. I hope you're right, because when I bid on the new job, when they changed it to the FAST team, And they said, your duties are going to be in the office, and you're going to do everything online. And, that didn't, in fact, I remember going to Chicago for the interview, and I had walking pneumonia, but I really wanted the job, but I didn't get it. And the girl who got it in Cleveland didn't keep it for very long. That might have changed since then. They may be out in the field. I hope so.
Well, as always, I mean, it's the FAA. There's going to be different parts of the FAA that have things that are good and things that are challenging. I spent the past year very deeply involved with the FAST team folks, because that's how we integrated all this new, educational stuff, which they haven't done before with the SocialFlight stuff. And I was very fortunate that there are some forward-looking people that were able to embrace that and push internally to get things done. So they're there, but of course that there's going to be different parts, and this isn't the enforcement part of the FAA either. So
I think, well, yeah, I have to confess, when I looked on your website and I saw all the fasting programs, I thought, do I really want to talk to this guy?
That's funny. It's always a double-edged sword when you do some work with the FAA.
But having talked to you at some length in the last few days, I very much appreciate talking to you. And you're doing the right thing, yes. But I forgot a big part of the story in Indianapolis was they had a very large freight operator down in Columbus, Indiana, who flew DC-3s, and they needed a DC-3 examiner and check pilot. So my old friend Leo Wonderly was in the Chicago district office, and he said, send Martha, she flies Lodestars, and so down to Opelika I went in the glory days of Opelika, and Hector Villamar and a bunch of kids from a outfit called SocialFlight or something like that out of Puerto Rico, and flew and just loved it. Although I have to admit, before I knew much about flying that airplane, it's, the difference between a DC-3 and a Lodestar is it's much more ponderous and much more. And on the ground, even with the tailwheel lock, there was a hurricane running through the south of the Keys. So Miami, the winds in Miami were high. And I thought, I hope this guy doesn't realize I have both feet on one rudder pedal trying to keep this thing straight. But you learn, and you learn. It's somebody said, "What's it like?" It's like dancing with your great aunt.
It's probably the first time someone's alluded to a Lodestar being light on the controls when you're doing it in comparison to a DC-3.
Well, when you think about it, it weighed 19,000 pounds, which is almost 10,000 pounds less than a DC-3 with the same engines. So the Lodestar was a lot more maneuverable. I mean, DC-3, you kind of turn the wheel and then wait and something happens. Although you can muscle it around, and I probably did 600 type ratings. I have about 1,000 hours in the airplane. And that involved more engine shutdowns, inadvertent shutdowns, than I've had in any other airplane.
Really?
It's old equipment. And some of these freight operators were less than first class.
Now, with the 1,000 hours, you have some probably more check rides, more time in a DC-3 than almost anyone in terms of instructing. Tell me a little bit more about that, because that's a big
first, every 6 months I would go down to Griffin, Georgia, and fly with Bob McSwiggan to keep my currency up. And then there were other FAA inspectors around the country, and sometimes they would say they couldn't make it, they had something else, and so the FAA would say, we've got the time, do you want to go? So I was back and forth to Griffin a lot, and we'd fly, I think, 10 hours. And that turned into a huge friendship also. That's where I got my seaplane ratings down there with Aubrey Sweezy.
In Georgia,
Oh,
really?
yeah, he had a lake amphibian. And I have to tell you, with some of these names, Aubrey Sweezy, Bob McSwiggan, it almost brings tears to my eyes. They were my heroes and my friends.
Oh,
Wow, they were wonderful people. Uh, and actually, when I got back home, I had told the FAA that I was going to get a single engine C rating. And I got back home and they said, you can't use this in the FAA for giving flight checks because you didn't take the flight check from an FAA inspector, you took it from an examiner. Okay, I'll take it from an examiner. And my buddy Mike Devaney had bought an Aranca Chief on floats and flew it down from Canada. And we parked it on a little estuary of the Ohio River. And Mike didn't have a seaplane rating. So I said, Mike, if you will teach me how to fly floats, I'll give you a seaplane rating, because I had to take the flight test in his airplane. So that's what we did. And then the FAA sent an inspector down from Grand Rapids. And I remember, if I go too long, stop me. I remember he arrived in nice leather shoes and he had a briefcase and a suit on. And we have this parked in a mud hole on the Little Miami River. You know, I'm thinking. So, and the right seat where he sat was very low. So I'm sitting there and hoping this thing doesn't quit, because that means if you're out in the water, you have to get out on a float and prop it from behind. And I wasn't very good at that. But I'd say to him, okay, you want to see a plow taxi? You want to see us? How about this? How about we do that? How about take off here? And he just kept nodding and saying yes. And very quickly, he said, that's fine. That's good.
let me out.
Yeah. So we came back and got in the G car. And I said, I'll take you back over to Greater Cincinnati Airport. Well, what I've missed in here was my story of landing on the Pennsylvania Turnpike in my 180 when it ran, when a cap came off and all the fuel in the airplane left, all of it in both tanks. And I had come out of the clouds, about 1,000 feet above the ground over the Poconos, and made the sign of the cross because I thought, this is it. And I see this white strip, and it was the Pennsylvania Turnpike. And I made a beautiful landing. And more importantly, I talked the cops into letting me get some fuel. The fire department said, we'll bring our fuel out, stopping traffic, and then let me take off. So when I'm driving my friend from Grand Rapids back over to Greater Cincinnati Airport after my seaplane test, the phone rang, and it was the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission. And they said, we don't understand this. We got a request from you for your charges for the Turnpike. And I said, well, yeah, I landed on the Turnpike and I never got a ticket. I want a ticket, you know, but I was again, almost in tears and laughter about what, and I think he thought, you know, I think he was a little sweet on me until that point. Well,
Oh my God, that's hilarious.
yeah, there was some
I want to talk a little bit about how you think things have changed over this long career that you continue to have. And that's an interesting point you brought up, because one thing that is an example of that is there seem to be many stories of folks that have had to make landings on roads in the past, and it didn't used to be that big a deal. It was people would help and then you could take back off. And that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. Now it seems like you could be on the widest, most empty road possible, and someone shows up and they're going to tell you to get a flatbed truck and disassemble the airplane. What? Tell me about what you've seen change and what you think about this.
Well, I think that's a good example of the whole drift of what has happened. And I think I mentioned to you, I got an email from a guy after my bridge caper, and he said, keep your keep shining. You're a light in a rule-bound community. And I know what he means. Things have become so rule-bound, and so the procedures are there was a wonderful article, and I think it was in IFR magazine, and AvWeb, I think, has it on their site today. You might look at it. And this guy says what I'm going to say in a much better way. And Sporty Hal Shevers says, Marv, he calls me Marv, we lived through the golden age of general aviation. And I think he's right about that. This guy in this article said, I got ramp checked. The inspector found out my medical was 2 days overdue. He put me in the G car, drove down the road to an AME he knew, and I got a medical. Now, that was the FAA 30, 40, 50 years ago. It's not that anymore at all. It's run by people in Washington. I don't think the district offices or the regional offices are any longer in existence, but it's run by people who are not pilots, and they don't understand this passion. Now, there are people who do dumb things. I mean, I know that sometimes it's because they don't care. Sometimes it's because they don't know. Usually it's because they don't know. And I was pilot examiner for, I guess 8 or 9 years after I left the FAA. And I flunked my share of applicants. But more often than not, you'd find a guy who, for instance, wasn't very good at crosswind landings, and I'd say, okay, the flight check's over, you passed. Now we're going to learn crosswind landings. And that would not fly with the FAA today.
Right.
They seem to be out to uncover the slightest. And when you think of the time and the money that it costs to prosecute these violations, it's crazy. It's really crazy. And I don't think we should sacrifice safety at all. But I think the FAA, of course, Congress took away their mandate to foster aviation some years ago, but they need to get back to that. They need to get back to fostering aviation, helping pilots. I used to say to guys in my safety seminars, there's a phone on my desk in the office and I'm in a room by myself. Call me if you have a problem or if you have a question, something you think you ought to know, but you don't, and we'll talk about it. And if I think they're going to come after you, I'll tell you that too. But I have to mirror what this guy said in this article today. If you do get a letter of investigation from the FAA for any reason, say nothing and call a lawyer. Yeah. You are not going to prevail on your own. You're not going to make liberal use of the NASA reporting forms. I have a file of them, literally a file of them, next to my file of actions against me in the FAA for taking the G car home, and I don't know, lots of stuff.
It seems perhaps connected to just a broader thing in society where we've lost a little bit of the humanity of the ability of people, regardless of their role, to apply that humanity and apply some judgment to a situation. I tell the boys, when I grew up, things were different. There were things you could do, and people would look at the intent and would look at what was involved, and it would change what the end result was versus the black and white of what the rules were. And that's not the world today.
No. And it has people worried. I mean, especially people who want to go on to airline careers. If something like that happens, they're shot down, or they feel like they're shot down. yeah, I very much miss the camaraderie that we all had when we learned to fly. And I'm not sure I would, in today's world, I'm not sure I would have stuck. Well, yeah, I would have, but I would have found a place where, there weren't 8-foot fences around the airport. And you and I talked a little about this. Anything I can do, you can do, or any of us can do to foster aviation interest in kids is really important, because I think what they're being fed is not the fun of flying. It's
Yeah.
The career potential, and I really don't think that's um, I don't think that's going to attract the right kind of people. I mean,
Yeah.
I would move heaven and earth to, and I did, to get back in the air this last year. But if it was just a job, no, I wouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think passion is what drives our industry. It drives our community, our industry, whatever aspects of general aviation you want to focus on.
And we
I mean,
talked a little bit about women in aviation, and I know I have some strange views on that. I'm not I'm not I'm not anti-women flying airplanes at all. Uh, what I am anti is having them do this because um, they think they ought to show they're as good as men. It's not
uh-huh.
that kind of a skill or of a profession.
Well,
You have to love
you're
airplanes.
right. It's based on the passion. It's based on that. I think what you're mentioning is so important is the idea of spreading this fascination that the people that are involved in aviation love. I mean, being a pilot, especially professionally, is not something you just do because it's the easy path. You do
That's
it
right.
because you love
That's
it.
right.
The rewards are few and far down the road for most that are involved. So it's about this love of flying and maybe whatever we can do with awareness. Um, I think that's really what we can do. Anything we can do to open up our arms
It's
and
important.
increase that.
And I always say anybody who expresses any interest in flying, I said, come on, I'll take you for a ride in the 180. I took a kid last week. He wanted to interview me for some class project, and with an unpronounceable Polish name, but a wonderful, wonderful kid. And here's a good example. He had gotten up to solo, but his medicals is being held up because 3 years ago he stopped taking the drug they were giving him for ADS. What's that stuff they give?
ADHD.
ADHD. Yeah. So 3 years ago, and when he mentioned that on his physical, which I said, but anyway, he mentioned it, and they're still fiddling around with this thing. And he said it's been back and forth and back and forth for a month.
Yeah.
And what do you tell somebody like that except, well,
Well,
try to get, go on and do some cross country dual and get ahead of the game a little bit. But he's so discouraged about
yeah.
that.
Well, aviation medical is one of those areas that it's hard to get past the black and white and get to the human being and get to the judgment.
Very
And
much so.
I think it'd be wonderful if, whether it were examiners or enforcers or enforcement people or FA medical people, it'd be wonderful if they were more empowered
Yes,
to use their
absolutely.
judgment
Yeah. Yeah.
themselves.
Uh,
But that may not be the case. Let's talk for a second about the elephant in the room, because obviously, you mentioned bridge, and that actually, of course, what bridge? I don't know what you're talking about. Um, when I was so excited and wanted you so much to be here on SocialFlight Live, the one thing I did not want to make this about is some apology tour for the bridge incident. But I do want to hear a little bit about it from your perspective and what you experienced through it as kind of like a takeaway to help other people.
well, the takeaway would be don't fly under a bridge these days because there's cameras, guys.
And ADSB.
And ADSB. And I had been out boring holes in the sky one day in the 180, and truly with no particular destination, but shoot a few approaches. And I was coming from the north, and I had some trouble with the transponder migrating out of the box, the pins. And every once in a while I'd give it a shove. Well, anyway.
Tray. Right, loosen the tray.
Yeah. So I was flying from an airport north of Cincinnati, belonged to a very dear friend of mine who was killed in an airplane accident. I was going over to Oxford, Ohio, Miami University, and I looked over my shoulder, and there was the Jeremiah Morrow Bridge, and it was the new one, which was even higher than the old one. And I'd been under that bridge. There's a walking trail, biking trail, canoe trail. You know, I knew what was underneath there, except I didn't know there were 2 state of Ohio employees with a webcam. And anyway, I said out loud, God, I have to do this one time before I didn't say that, before I'm too old to do it. And I turned the airplane and I flew under the bridge, and it was glorious. And I pulled up on the other side and was laughing, and went over to Oxford, and I called Cincinnati Approach to get some vectors for a couple approaches over there, and they said they weren't receiving my, the ADSB information, altitude information. So I pushed on it, and I went over and shot a couple of landings, and I came back and asked them for the vectors back into Lunken. And again, they told me the transponder was not working. So I landed, and a week went by, almost a week, and I got a phone call, and it was an inspector from the Cincinnati FSDO, and I did not know him. These are new guys. And he said, did you fly under the Jeremiah Morrow Bridge in your 180? And I said, yes, I did. And he said, did you turn your transponder off? And I said, no, I didn't. So I got a letter of investigation about a week later, and I called a lawyer in Washington, Kathy Yodis, who with her father has a good aviation law firm. And a year went by, an entire year. Now, I knew enough about the FAA enforcement proceedings that if they don't do something in 6 months and it's a suspension, it dies. They have to act within 6 months. Well, 6 months went by, and I'd say to Kathy, do you think maybe? And she said, wait and see. A year to the day after flying under the bridge, there was a package on my front porch, and it said, emergency revocation of all your certificates, send everything in. And boy, it was like a punch in the gut, you know. Although I have to say, I had put a little St. Christopher medal in my mailbox all year. And I would, whenever I reach for the mail, I'd think, stay with me. Well, he didn't. And I got this, and I turned in all my certificates. And Kathy was able to cut down on a revocation, you have to wait a year before applying for for a student certificate. And they cut it down to 9 months. So meanwhile, I took the private written and the instrument written. And then on Christmas Eve, I took the private pilot flight check. And I'm close to taking the instrument flight check. I have to tell you, those written exams are not what they were 50 years ago. And
I can only imagine.
In that way, it was good for me. I was crushed. I mean, it's my whole life. It's me. I'm not anything but an airplane person. I occasionally needlepoint and bake, but and garden, but airplanes and men. But there were good things that came out of it. Now, there were a few people who thought I ought to go to jail, and that I didn't deserve to ever darken the skies again. But by far, most of the letters, the emails to the magazine and to me, phone calls, not only old friends, but people I'd never known before. And the outpouring of support was beautiful, and it helped, really helped keep me going. Really helped.
One of the things I wanted to get your perspective on having to do with this is that so many people who are pilots have put so much of their lives into it that it's not something we do. It's something we identify with as who we are. And I think most pilots, when they're asked to, tell me about yourself, that's one of the first things they'll say. Not because they're bragging, as the jokes may go, but
it's just
because it's what their passion is. It's who we are. And then we are in this thing that can be taken away for us. It could be for a violation, but it could also be just a medical issue. It could be anything. And what are your thoughts on this idea of someone maintaining that sense of self when the act of flying is taken away from them?
That's a hard one. The best thing I could say would be, especially if you own an airplane, and it becomes, I mean, sometimes I hug my airplane. Sometimes I cry on my airplane. Find somebody to fly with you who's licensed, and keep flying. Keep flying. Don't give it up. People talk about how hard it is not to be able to drive a car anymore. I almost think it's harder for flying. And as long as you're mentally, with it, capable, keep flying, and keep bugging them about the medical. I mean, things change. There was a wonderful AME out east of Cincinnati who I used to go to all the time, Bill Terrell. God bless him, he's gone now, but he would move heaven and earth, and he knew people in the FAA, in the medical division, who he could talk to about something. And that was very bad. I mean, come on, if they can get an alcoholic airline pilot back in the cockpit in a month, then there ought to be some relaxing of the conditions that are keeping people out. I'll tell you a story I probably shouldn't tell you, but I know how painful this is. I have a good friend who owns a hot airplane. Hot. I won't say what it is, but it's twin engine, and it's high performance. And he cannot get his medical back because of oxygen starvation event that he's taken all the psychological tests, and he is a doctor, and he's taken test after test after test, and keeps being refused. And he called me a couple of weeks ago, and he said, I'm flying it to, I don't know where. He said, what are the chances of a ramp check? And I said, I don't think the chances of a ramp check, especially these days when the FAA is pretty understaffed, I don't think that's something you need to lose any sleep over. But I said, we'll say this, if you have an accident, be sure you kill yourself.
Oof. Well, I think one of the, we've all known people that have, lost the ability to fly for one or another reason. I think one of the things that I always think of is you're a pilot regardless of whether or not you currently have your certificate, your medical, whether you're able to do the controls yourself. You're still a pilot. If you're someone that went through all of this, that did this in your career and has the ability and knowledge as to how to climb into the cockpit and does this, I think you're that for the rest of your life in who you are.
I probably have a group of 30 people who have either gotten too old or have medical issues or retired airline pilots who don't fly, and we email back and forth constantly, and they are as impassioned about aviation as I am.
And they're all still pilots.
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's something to be very proud of. Yeah.
Well, Martha, on that note, I'd like to thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to join us here on Social Flight Live. It's a blessing. I'd love to have you back on the show at some point. There's so much more we have to talk about.
Thank you, Jeff. It's been a pleasure. It truly has. I appreciate you, and I appreciate your help in setting this up, because as you see, as a friend of mine says, machinery doesn't love you, Martha.
Well, fortunately, the airplanes do, and your readers do, and so many people have written in anticipation of this show. And so, thank you for everything that you do. I appreciate it, and so does everyone else. Keep writing, keep flying, and I look forward to having you back here on Social Flight Live.
God bless you all. Thanks.
And to all of you, thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to join us here on Social Flight Live, as always. And with that, we will be out next week at Sun and Fun. As I mentioned at the beginning of the show, we'll have some things uploaded to YouTube during the show, but we will be back on Tuesday, April 12th, honoring the WASPs, a very special show there with Nicole Malachowski, U.S. Air Force, retired from the Thunderbirds. And she's going to be coming back on the show, and is truly wonderful person, and with a special guest that has helped her get recognition for the WASPs and their ability to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery, which is incredibly important. So be sure to join us for that. We are back again Tuesday, April 12th at 8 p.m. as always. Until next time, I wish you all blue skies.